Frank Miller had a theory about peace and property lines. Both are fine until someone crosses them, he used to say, mostly to his dog, Buddy, while sipping coffee on the porch that faced his uncle's old farmland. Every morning was the same, and that's exactly how he liked it. The sun came up lazy over the low hills, sprinklers whispered in the distance, and the smell of cut grass mixed with the faint tang of diesel from his old John Deere tractor. Out here, time moved slow enough that even the birds didn't rush. Frank was 62, retired, and proud of it. After 40 years as a land surveyor, he'd traded deadlines for daylight. He'd inherited these acres from his late uncle, along with a tin shed, a handful of stubborn fence posts, and a property line he knew like the back of his hand. Across the road, the world had changed. Neat houses stacked in rows, each one painted a different shade of beige, identical mailboxes standing like soldiers, and driveways polished enough to eat off. The sign at the entrance read, Cedar Ridge Estates, a harmonious community. Frank thought it looked more like a subdivision where harmony went to die. He wasn't unfriendly. He waved to the morning joggers, helped the mailman patch a flat tire once, even attended one neighborhood barbecue, though he left early when they started arguing over what color their fences should emotionally convey. He just liked his space, the kind that smelled of soil and not scented mulch. That Tuesday morning began like every other. Coffee in hand, Buddy at his feet, Frank watched a hawk trace lazy circles above the field. It was his favorite part of the day, the quiet before the leaf blowers started. That was when he noticed a woman in yoga pants and oversized sunglasses standing at his gate. Clipboard, posture like she just smelled something unpleasant, and the unmistakable air of authority no one had actually granted her. "Morning," Frank called. She nodded curtly. "Sir, I'm Karen Ledbetter, president of the Cedar Ridge HOA. He sipped his coffee, unimpressed. "Good for you." She frowned at that, flipping through her papers. "Are you aware that your property is currently in violation of community standards?" "Community standards," he repeated, amused. "Ma'am, this here's farmland. Closest thing to a community standard I follow is keeping the cows off the road." Karen looked scandalized. "This field faces our subdivision directly. Our residents have expressed concerns that its unmanaged appearance detracts from the visual cohesion of the neighborhood." Frank leaned on the porch rail, squinting at her. "Unmanaged, huh? You mean grass? The green stuff nature put here before you did." Her lips tightened. "You'll receive a formal notice this week. I strongly suggest you address it promptly." And with that, she turned on her heel and marched back toward her SUV, her ponytail bobbing with indignation. Frank watched her go, Buddy wagging his tail like he'd just witnessed the start of something interesting. He didn't think much of it that day. People with clipboards had come and gone all his life. Inspectors, contractors, tax assessors, all convinced they knew more than the man who'd spent decades mapping dirt. But sure enough, 3 days later, there it was. A letter in his mailbox stamped with gold lettering and self-importance. Notice of Violation Section 3B. Unsightly properties impacting community aesthetics. He laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. The letter cited unkempt vegetation exceeding the acceptable length threshold and failure to maintain visual continuity with neighboring lots. He turned it over, expecting a joke. But no, it was signed, dated, and even had a return envelope for fine submission. Frank folded it neatly and pinned it to his fridge. "Look, Buddy," he said, tapping the paper. "We're criminals now." Later that afternoon, he mentioned it to Dale, his neighbor and fishing buddy. Dale snorted. "Karen Ledbetter's at it again. She fined my wife last month because our porch gnome wasn't HOA approved height." "Approved height," Frank repeated, chuckling. "What's next? Certified oxygen?" Still, the letter gnawed at him. Not out of fear, but disbelief. He wasn't even part of their HOA. His property lay just beyond their jurisdiction. He knew that better than anyone. He'd drawn those lines himself for the county years ago. The next morning, he drove down to the HOA office, a small, overly air-conditioned building beside the community pool. The receptionist looked 12 and terrified. "I'd like to speak to your president," Frank said politely. Moments later, Karen emerged, clipboard in hand like a sheriff with a badge. "Mr. Miller," she said, tone dripping with condescension. "We received no landscaping update from you." "Because I don't owe you one," he said, smiling. "Your HOA stops 32 feet short of my fence. I checked the map this morning." Karen's expression didn't falter. "Our board voted to include bordering lots under our view protection clause. It ensures all visible areas adhere to our visual standards." "Ma'am," Frank said slowly, "you can vote to outlaw gravity if you want. Doesn't make it stop working." For a moment, she seemed to short-circuit. Then she recovered. "If you refuse compliance, we'll escalate this matter through proper channels." "Please do," he said cheerfully. "I've got all day." When he got home, another letter was already waiting in the mailbox. Second notice, final warning. He pinned that one beside the first like trophies. Days turned into a week. Frank carried on mowing when he felt like it, sipping coffee, waving at the occasional neighbor brave enough to wave back. But now he noticed the subtle shift. Conversations quieting when he walked by. The HOA newsletter mysteriously arriving in his mailbox though he wasn't on their list. The headline read, "Maintaining Standards. Every lot matters." Then came the kicker. One morning, Frank spotted a group of people, Karen among them, standing near his property line, pointing, gesturing, and holding up blueprints. When he approached, they scattered like pigeons. "Something I can help you with?" he asked. Karen forced a smile. "Just preliminary plans for a community retail project. The area could use some revitalization." Frank raised an eyebrow. "On my land." "It's adjacent," she said too quickly. "The boundary's flexible." He chuckled. "That's not how boundaries work." She ignored him, barking orders at a contractor to measure again, just to be sure. He watched them drive stakes into soil he'd owned since before her subdivision existed. He could almost hear his uncle's voice in his head. "Don't argue with fools, Frankie. They'll drag you down to their level and beat you with experience." That night, Frank sat on his porch long after the sun went down. The letters, the gossip, the entitled certainty. It all piled up in his mind like storm clouds. He wasn't angry yet, but he could feel it stirring, that quiet line between patience and resolve. He reached for his folder, the one labeled property deed and boundary survey. Inside were every document, every recorded plat, every signature proving what was his. He ran his fingers over the old paper, tracing the coordinates he knew by heart. Buddy barked at something in the distance. Maybe a raccoon, maybe just the wind, and Frank smiled faintly. "Easy, boy. We'll handle this the polite way." He poured himself another cup of coffee, though it was well past midnight, and stared out at the field bathed in moonlight. Beyond the fence, Cedar Ridge glowed with porch lights, each house a perfect clone of the next, every window drawn tight. Frank had spent a lifetime respecting lines, invisible ones, legal ones, moral ones. He never crossed them, but lately it felt like someone else had. When the third envelope arrived 2 days later, this one thicker and stamped, "Final notice. Action pending." Frank didn't even open it right away. He just stared at it, the weight of absurdity finally landing. Then he smiled, slow and certain. "That letter," he said softly, almost amused, "changed everything." The funny thing about HOA wars is that they never start loud. They begin with whispers, quiet gossip in driveways, polite nods that suddenly vanish, neighbors who used to wave now pretending to check their mail instead. By the following week, Frank Miller could feel it. He wasn't the quiet retiree with the old tractor anymore. He was that guy with the messy field. It started with the newsletter. Someone slid it into his mailbox even though he wasn't a paying member. The headline in bold italics read, "Maintaining Visual Harmony. Every Neighbor's Responsibility." There was a paragraph about unsightly border lots harming property values, accompanied by a small stock photo of an unkempt field. It wasn't his photo, but it might as well have been. He poured another cup of coffee, laughed quietly, and tacked that newsletter next to his collection of HOA letters. His fridge door was starting to look like a war memorial for nonsense. The next strike came disguised as a friendly visit. Frank was oiling his tractor when he heard a voice behind him say, "Lovely machine, but perhaps it's time to upgrade to something a little less industrial?" He turned to see Karen, dressed like she'd just come from a real estate photo shoot, standing with two other board members holding clipboards. "We've received several complaints about noise and odor during your mowing sessions," she said. Frank wiped his hands on a rag, calm as ever. "Ma'am, the noise you're talking about is called a motor. The smell is called grass. Both are older than your HOA. Her associates exchanged awkward glances, but Karen pressed on. "We'd like to formally request that you schedule mowing only between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. on weekdays, to minimize disturbance." He blinked slowly. "You're trying to schedule the wind now?" Karen didn't smile. "You can choose cooperation or escalation, Mr. Miller." "Escalation," he said cheerfully. "Always did like mountain climbing." They left, offended, heels clicking against his gravel driveway like punctuation marks. By the next morning, his truck had an orange sticker on the windshield, "Violation. Abandoned vehicle." The note explained that stationary, visibly aged vehicles were prohibited in the Cedar Ridge community. Frank stared at it, genuinely impressed. They'd towed neighbors' cars before, but his wasn't even parked on their side of the road. He peeled off the sticker, folded it carefully, and dropped it in his filing cabinet under evidence of idiocy. Later that day, Dale stopped by with 2 fishing poles and a grin. "You've made the newsletter and the rumor mill. They're saying you're a non-compliant neighbor." Frank laughed. "Guess I'm the outlaw of Cedar Ridge." "Careful," Dale said. "They might issue a bounty." The two of them sat under the oak tree by the fence, sipping iced tea and watching a few HOA members walk their identical poodles along the sidewalk. One woman pointed toward Frank's field, shaking her head. "I swear," Dale whispered, "they think weeds are contagious." But the real storm came at the next HOA meeting. Frank decided to attend, not to argue, but out of curiosity. The clubhouse smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and desperation. The folding chairs squeaked as people shifted nervously. A table in the front displayed donuts that no one touched. Karen stood at the podium like she was addressing the United Nations. "This meeting concerns ongoing violations and our upcoming Cedar Ridge retail revitalization project," she began, her tone sanctimonious enough to polish marble. When Frank raised his hand, half the room turned to look. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "before you revitalize anything, you might want to check your property lines. You're building that thing partly on my land." The room went so quiet you could hear the air conditioner wheeze. Karen blinked, unfazed. "That's inaccurate. The development zone falls entirely within Cedar Ridge jurisdiction." Frank opened a manila folder, the same one he'd brought just in case. "According to the county plat from 1983, filed by me incidentally, the jurisdiction ends exactly 32 feet before the line you've staked." She smiled, but it was the kind of smile people wear when they've already decided you're wrong. "Our lawyers have reviewed the boundary. Perhaps yours is outdated." "Outdated," he said. "Land doesn't move unless someone pays it to." A man in the back chuckled before catching Karen's glare. The meeting ended with the kind of forced civility only suburbia can produce. Karen promised to verify the data, and Frank promised to watch with interest. As he left, he noticed a sign taped to the clubhouse door. "No recording devices allowed during HOA meetings." Probably a new rule just for him. The next week, construction trucks rolled up anyway. Bulldozers pushed soil. Men in hard hats measured twice and cut once. And a big white banner went up, "Future site of Cedar Ridge Retail Hub, managed by Ledbetter Developments." Ledbetter, Karen's last name. Frank stared at it for a long time, his hands in his pockets. "Well, buddy," he muttered to his dog. "Either she's building a mall, or she's finally found a place to store her ego." He wasn't even angry, yet more fascinated. How could someone be so bold and so blind at the same time? The survey stakes clearly crossed into his land, but they kept building as if paperwork didn't exist. By Friday, the gossip had gone from whispers to open talk. At the diner downtown, people chuckled behind coffee mugs. You hear about Karen? Building a mall half on someone else's farm. One guy said she'd even told reporters that the community was expanding its footprint. Another claimed she called Frank a disgruntled holdout. Dale brought him the article. Says you're resisting progress. Frank read it carefully, smiled, and folded the paper. Progress, huh? Funny, progress used to come with permits. That evening, a different kind of letter arrived. This one wasn't from the HOA, it was from a contractor. They wanted permission to temporarily access his property for equipment storage. Polite tone, legal jargon, but the message was clear. They knew they were crossing lines and hoped he'd stay quiet. Frank didn't reply. Instead, he began keeping notes, times, dates, photographs of the encroachment. He measured the distance between stakes with a precision tape, jotting numbers like a man recording history. It wasn't anger driving him. It was habit. Surveyors live by proof. Then came the public humiliation moment. Saturday morning. Frank woke to the sound of clanging metal and laughter. When he stepped outside, he saw 3 HOA members gathered near his gate, posting a sign that read, Future View Corridor, Beautification Pending. He crossed the road, calm as always. What's this supposed to be? Karen appeared from her SUV, beaming. We're announcing our commitment to enhancing the border view. This signage is temporary, of course. Of course, Frank said. Just one problem. He pointed to the dirt beneath the signpost. That spot you just dug up? That's still on my property. Karen's smile faltered for the briefest second before snapping back. We'll verify that. Good idea, he said. Might want to do it before I send the invoice. That night, he sat on his porch again, the New View Corridor sign glowing faintly under the streetlights like a personal insult. He wasn't the sort to stew in anger, but even he had to admit they'd earned themselves a special kind of response. He looked at Buddy, who was gnawing a stick near the porch steps. What do you say, boy? Think it's time to remind them who drew the map? Buddy wagged his tail. Frank leaned back in his chair, listening to the distant hum of construction equipment still running past dusk. They think they're building a mall, he murmured. They don't realize they're building it for me. Somewhere across the street, Karen's voice echoed faintly over the commotion, giving instructions to workers like a queen commanding her subjects. Frank smiled into his coffee, the kind of smile that said the game had officially started. He'd played this one before, just not with houses and hedges. In his working days, he'd seen cities misdraw maps, companies lose millions over an inch of land, developers crumble over one clause buried in a deed. And if Cedar Ridge wanted to test boundaries, he was happy to teach them how boundaries bite back. The sprinklers hissed on, watering a field the HOA didn't own. Fireflies flickered in the tall grass like sparks of quiet defiance. Frank leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the glowing banner across the road. He wasn't angry anymore, just patient and curious. He took one last sip of coffee and said softly to himself, I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. They say there are 2 kinds of revenge, loud and legal. Frank Miller had always preferred the second kind. It was slower, quieter, and infinitely more satisfying. The morning after that View Corridor stunt, he drove into town with a calm so deliberate it almost looked suspicious. He stopped by the county clerk's office, where the linoleum still smelled like the 1970s, and signed in with a pen attached to the counter by a chain. The clerk, a young guy with a name tag that said Ethan, looked up and said, Can I help you, sir? Probably not, Frank said, setting a folder on the counter. But the law can. He unlatched the folder with the care of a man presenting evidence in a trial. Out came a series of folded plats, maps, and recorded deeds. Frank spread them across the counter. The lines, the numbers, the lot boundaries, he knew them like an old hymn. I need these verified and certified as current, he said. Particularly this section. He tapped the red-marked edge where Cedar Ridge met his property. Ethan squinted at the map, then at his computer. Looks like the HOA filed a boundary expansion last year, but it wasn't finalized. You're still the recorded owner of the adjacent parcel. Frank smiled faintly. That's all I needed to hear. He paid the processing fee, got the official stamp, and walked out into the morning sunshine with the calm stride of a man who just loaded a chessboard with all his best pieces. Over the next few days he got to work, not with power tools or tractors but with patience. Every evening, he'd sit at his kitchen table under the hum of the old ceiling fan, examining zoning ordinances and cross-referencing property tax records. Years of working as a surveyor had left him with a love for paperwork most people would consider a mental illness. But Frank didn't see papers, he saw weapons. Every document was a boundary, every signature a shield. By Thursday, he'd filed 2 forms. One clarifying his property line with updated GPS coordinates, and another registering an easement clause. A neat little legal trick granting him access rights to any structure or improvement crossing into his land. It didn't say he owned their mall. It just said if they touched his soil, he had rights to it. He called his lawyer, an old colleague named Cliff who'd retired twice already but still liked helping with small mischief. You're saying they built over your boundary? Cliff asked. Oh, they're building a whole shopping complex, Frank replied, his voice mild as honey. There was a long whistle on the other end. You got proof. Photographs, coordinates, and about 12 witnesses who call themselves neighbors but talk too loud on Facebook. Cliff chuckled. I'll draft the letters. You sit tight. That weekend, Frank walked the edge of his land like a general inspecting a front line. Construction was in full swing now. Heavy machinery, piles of steel beams, clouds of dust hanging in the air like judgment. The noise was deafening, but he found it oddly peaceful. The louder they got, the more silent his plan became. He carried a small survey marker, a wooden stake painted white, topped with a red flag. At the exact point where his land and the development overlapped, he drove it into the ground with 3 solid strikes. The workers nearby barely noticed. One of them shouted, Hey, old man, careful where you're standing. Frank waved politely. Don't worry, son. I'm standing exactly where I'm supposed to. When he got back home, he sat on the porch with Buddy curled at his feet and watched the dust settle. From that distance, the construction site looked like an anthill. Everyone busy, everyone convinced they knew what they were doing. He wondered if any of them realized that half their foundation was technically resting on his patience. The following Monday, the first ripple hit. A city inspector stopped by his property asking to verify access routes for the mall. Frank greeted him kindly, handed over the freshly stamped deed, and pointed out the line where his ownership began. The inspector's eyebrows shot up. Wait, they're building past this? They sure are, Frank said. Good thing you caught it before they poured concrete. But the inspector's truck was barely gone when Karen showed up, storming out of her SUV like a weather front in heels. You went to the county, she accused, her voice shrill enough to rattle Buddy's ears. Sure did, Frank said. Needed to make sure I understood the rules. Wouldn't want to break any. Her sunglasses couldn't hide the twitch in her jaw. You're deliberately obstructing a community project. I'm enforcing a property line, he said evenly. Same difference, depending on which side of it you're on. She took a deep breath, then plastered on that familiar artificial smile. You realize the community will hold you responsible for any delays. Frank smiled back. You realize you built your delays on my dirt. She turned and marched off without another word. He could almost see the steam coming out of her ears. Over the next week, the tone around Cedar Ridge shifted again. Neighbors who once whispered behind curtains now watched him openly. Some were curious, others nervous. A few even offered support. One older lady from 2 houses down stopped her car and rolled down the window. You give him hell, Mr. Miller, she said with a wink. Frank wasn't interested in hell. He was after something far more divine. Irony. He spent that Friday evening writing out a single-page letter to the developers. It was polite, almost friendly. It explained the boundary issue, cited his ownership documents, and noted his new easement clause. He ended it with, I trust this matter will be handled amicably. Should you require continued access, please contact my attorney regarding leasing arrangements. He mailed it certified, sat back, and waited. Days passed. The trucks kept rolling, the concrete kept pouring, and Karen kept pretending he didn't exist. But Frank could feel the shift under the surface, like pressure building in a dam. Bureaucracy is slow, but when it breaks, it floods. He found amusement in small moments. The HOA sent another newsletter boasting that the Cedar Ridge Retail Hub will open by summer. The banner across the road now read, Ledbetter Plaza, a community vision. He took a photo of it for the scrapbook he'd started calling Evidence of Arrogance. One morning, Dale came by, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're letting them build anyway?" "Oh, I'm letting them finish," Frank said, smiling. "It's more fun that way. You're playing with fire, Frank." "No," he said, eyes twinkling. "They're the ones building the fire pit. I'm just selling them the land under it." That night, a small rainstorm swept through town, washing dust off the newly laid foundations. The smell of wet concrete drifted across the road, mingling with the scent of Frank's coffee. He sat on the porch with Buddy and listened to the crickets resume their song after the rain. He thought of his uncle, who'd always said, "People don't read signs, Frankie. They just assume the world belongs to them until someone shows them the deed." He smiled. "Guess it's showtime, Uncle Earl." Over the next few days, he noticed a subtle but satisfying detail. Someone had removed the Future View corridor sign from his fence. No apology, no acknowledgement, just gone. The silence was worth more than any words. He spent that weekend preparing one last document, an affidavit confirming the recorded encroachment. It was dry reading, but to him it sang like poetry. Lines, measurements, signatures. The symphony of accountability. By Sunday night, he'd done everything he needed. The trap was set, and all he had to do now was wait for them to walk into it. The lights from the construction site blinked through the trees like a city skyline. Frank watched them with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd already won, but didn't mind letting his opponent play another round. He wasn't out for revenge anymore. It was something deeper, a test of patience, of principle. He didn't shout. He didn't sue. He simply wrote things down, filed them neatly, and trusted that the same system used to bully people could also humble them. As he leaned back in his chair, Buddy resting his head on his boot, Frank whispered the words he'd been waiting to say since the day this started. They had no idea what was coming. The first rail crack appeared one Monday morning when the sound of jackhammers abruptly stopped. For weeks, construction noise had been the soundtrack to Frank's mornings. Metal clanging, diesel engines growling, men shouting over the hum of progress. But that day, silence rolled across the neighborhood like fog. He stepped onto the porch with his coffee, and there they were, half a dozen workers standing in the mud, arms folded, staring down at something on the ground. Frank didn't need binoculars to guess what they'd found. He'd marked that boundary stake himself. White wood with a red flag that fluttered like a taunt. It stood exactly where it should, only now it was surrounded by confusion. One of the men pulled out a clipboard. Another gestured wildly toward the new foundation that stretched a few feet past it. Frank took a sip of his coffee. "Well, would you look at that?" he murmured to Buddy. By noon, the site supervisor, a burly man named Hank, was at his gate. "You Mr. Miller?" he asked, already exasperated. "Last I checked," Frank said. Hank rubbed his neck. "We got a little boundary hiccup here. County surveyor's out sick, but we'll sort it out soon." Frank nodded slowly, pretending to be sympathetic. "I'm sure you will. Just make sure your insurance is paid up before you pour any more concrete." Hank squinted. "You threatening a lawsuit?" Frank smiled. "Not at all. Just stating topography." By the next morning, the HOA's calm veneer had officially cracked. Karen's SUV appeared first, followed by a silver sedan and a golf cart that said, Cedar Ridge Enforcement. They marched toward the site like generals on inspection. Within minutes, the air was filled with overlapping voices, all of them arguing in tones too polite to be civil. Frank stood by his fence, arms folded, watching the performance. A couple of neighbors had gathered behind him, pretending to walk their dogs but clearly there for the show. He overheard snippets, jurisdictional oversight, temporary boundary variance, compliance review, phrases that sounded like smoke trying to disguise fire. Then, in the middle of it all, Karen noticed him watching. "Mr. Miller," she called out, striding toward him. "Perhaps we could discuss this rationally." "I'm always rational," he said. "Can't speak for your foundation." She forced a laugh, the kind of laugh that hides panic. "Our engineers assure us everything is in order." "Good to know," Frank said, holding up his phone. "Because I just emailed the county recorder with updated photos. They'll love the part where your mall's front entrance sits on a privately owned agricultural lot." Her face paled just enough to betray her calm. "That's a serious accusation." "Not an accusation," he said lightly. "Just coordinates." Later that afternoon, a white SUV with the county seal rolled up. Out stepped an inspector in a high-visibility vest, clipboard in hand. He looked around, compared notes, and frowned. "This can't be right. The permit lines don't match the actual site." Karen fluttered around him like a distressed peacock. "There must be a clerical error." "Ma'am," the inspector said, "the error's made of concrete." Frank didn't say a word. He just whistled softly for Buddy and went inside. By the next day, word had spread. The local Facebook group lit up with posts. "Anyone know why construction stopped? Heard the mall's on the wrong land. Karen says it's fake news." Someone even posted a photo of Frank's red marker stake with the caption, "The little flag that ruined Cedar Ridge." The HOA scrambled to control the narrative. Karen sent out a mass email titled Clarification on Property Partnership. It claimed the HOA and local landowners were collaborating for mutual community benefit. Frank nearly spat out his coffee laughing. "Collaborating," he repeated. "That's one word for it." Within 48 hours, the developer's lawyers had contacted his lawyer, Cliff. The tone was cautious, polite, almost pleading. They wanted a meeting to resolve a small misunderstanding. Frank agreed, provided it took place in writing. Meanwhile, the HOA called an emergency general assembly. Frank wasn't invited, but he didn't need to be. Dale attended as a concerned resident and reported back like a spy. "Buddy, it was glorious," he said, laughing so hard he could barely breathe. "They're blaming each other. Karen says the builders messed up. The builders say she approved the wrong map. And someone even suggested you moved the stakes in the night." "Moved the stakes," Frank said, grinning. "I haven't moved that fast in years." By Thursday, chaos had achieved full bloom. Construction equipment sat idle. The county issued a stop work order pending investigation. News crews showed up, cameras rolling, narrating live from the half-built mall. A surprising property dispute threatens to derail a multi-million-dollar project in Cedar Ridge Estates. Frank's phone rang nonstop, reporters, lawyers, curious neighbors, even one YouTube channel that did local scandal exposés. He ignored most of them, except the reporter who knocked politely on his door and introduced himself as a fan of good old-fashioned irony. "Off the record," the reporter said, "how does it feel watching them implode?" Frank thought about it for a moment. Like watching someone run a red light in slow motion. You try to warn them, they wave you off, and now you just hope the airbags work. That quote made the front page the next morning. Karen was livid. She confronted him later that afternoon, her voice trembling somewhere between rage and desperation. "You're ruining years of community effort." "I'm preserving decades of property rights," Frank replied calmly. "You'll regret this," she hissed. He chuckled. "You've been saying that for months. When does the regret start exactly?" She turned and stormed off, but not before muttering something about lawyers and intent to sue. Frank just smiled and went back to trimming his roses. The neighborhood by now had divided into two camps, Team Frank and Team HOA. Some residents brought him baked goods. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Kids rode their bikes past his fence yelling, "Miller Mall," and laughing. Then came the day of the official confrontation. It happened in the half-finished parking lot under a blazing afternoon sun. Folding chairs were set up hastily, a makeshift podium stood crooked, and someone even brought a microphone that squealed with feedback every time Karen spoke. She called it a special session on community integrity. Frank called it a comedy show. Standing before a restless crowd, Karen launched into a speech about shared values and the greater good, painting the mall as a unifying symbol. But every few sentences, someone from the audience shouted questions. Did you check the deeds? Who signed the permits? Why does it say Miller Property on the map? Finally, she lost her composure. This man is exploiting a technicality, she snapped, pointing directly at Frank. Frank raised a hand mildly. Ma'am, if respecting boundaries is exploitation, I'm guilty. The crowd murmured. Even the developer's rep looked like he wanted to applaud. And that's when the final blow landed. A courier arrived mid-meeting, handing Karen a thick envelope. She tore it open, read the first page, and froze. The county had issued an official ruling. The disputed portion of land was, beyond all question, part of Parcel 27B, owned by one Frank Miller. The audience erupted in whispers. Cameras clicked. Karen's face turned the shade of uncooked dough. Frank didn't gloat. He simply stepped forward, offered her a polite nod, and said, "Looks like the county just redrew your plans for you." She said nothing. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Arguments, accusations, people packing up chairs in angry silence. Frank walked home slowly, Buddy padding beside him, while behind them the voices rose like a storm eating itself. When he reached his porch, he turned once more toward the site. The banner that once read, Ledbetter Plaza, flapped limply in the wind, one corner torn loose. He took a long breath, savoring the quiet after months of noise. Then, for the first and only time, he broke the fourth wall, not to gloat, but to share the absurdity. At this point, he said, his voice calm and amused, I've got to ask, have you ever dealt with an HOA like this? Drop your story in the comments, hit subscribe if you love poetic justice, and let's see how many of us have survived HOA brutality. He smiled faintly, set his coffee cup down, and looked back at the half-built mall gleaming under the afternoon sun. Then, he said softly, I got another letter, this time addressed to Mr. Miller, property owner of record. When the letter arrived, it was thick, too heavy to be a threat, too polite to be friendly. Frank knew that weight well. Paper always gave itself away. He sliced it open with his pocket knife, unfolded the crisp stationery, and smiled before he even finished the first paragraph. The developers, in full corporate apology mode, were eager to resolve a small property overlap matter in a mutually beneficial manner. They were offering to lease the portion of his land that their mall had swallowed by accident. Buddy barked once, as if to say, we did it. Frank poured himself a cup of coffee, leaned back in his chair, and reread the offer. The phrasing was all velvet and vinegar. Every sentence trying to sound generous while admitting they'd built part of a multimillion-dollar complex on someone else's dirt. Somewhere between amicable resolution and ongoing partnership potential. He almost laughed. They'd spent 6 months ignoring him, and now they were begging to pay rent. He picked up the phone and called Cliff, his lawyer. You sitting down? Frank asked. Cliff chuckled. Always am these days. They want to lease the land, Frank said. The sound of laughter on the other end was long and genuine. Oh, that's beautiful. They finally read the deed. Huh. Seems so. I'm thinking we let them. Maybe at a rate that reflects the entertainment value. Cliff was still laughing. Send me the paperwork. I'll make sure they pay enough to fund your next 5 retirements. By the end of the week, it was official. The very section of land the HOA once called unsightly was now legally recognized as part of Miller Holdings, LLC. Cliff insisted on the name, said it sounded professional. Frank didn't care about fancy titles. He just liked that it irritated Karen. The day the contract was signed, the developer's representatives met Frank at the property line. Suits, ties, handshakes, all trying to look calm while sweating through their collars. They'd brought Karen, too, perhaps as a gesture of goodwill or poetic punishment. Mr. Miller, one of the men began, we appreciate your cooperation and understanding in this matter. Frank smiled faintly. Oh, I'm very understanding. Boundaries are my specialty. Karen stood beside them, sunglasses hiding her expression, though the tightness in her jaw gave her away. The man handed Frank a folder, the finalized lease agreement. He flipped through it, reading every line out loud just to make them sweat. Monthly rent, he said, tapping the page. To be paid directly to me for use of the overlapping parcel. 30-year term. Adjustment for inflation every 5 years. He closed the folder with a soft thump. Seems fair. The developer forced a smile. We're glad we could come to an arrangement. Karen muttered something about community spirit. Frank handed her a pen. Would you mind signing as witness? HOA involvement and all. Good to have things documented properly this time. She froze. He could see the internal war play out behind her glasses. But she signed anyway, the pen trembling slightly as she wrote her name. Karen Ledbetter, President, Cedar Ridge HOA. He extended his hand. Pleasure doing business, ma'am. Her handshake was as limp as a wet napkin. The following week, the local paper ran the headline, Property Dispute Ends in Private Lease Agreement. Mall to proceed as Miller Commons. Someone at the paper clearly had a sense of humor, because the subheading read, HOA President signs deal with local landowner after jurisdiction mishap. For Frank, the victory wasn't in the money, though it was nothing to sneeze at. It was in the quiet irony, the slow turning of the wheel where arrogance became apology. He didn't gloat, didn't strut, didn't make speeches. He just kept mowing his field, now technically part of a shopping complex. Neighbors began to stop by again, the tension melting away like ice in the sun. Mrs. Jensen brought him a pie. Dale showed up with a six-pack. Even the mailman, who'd watched the whole saga unfold from the sidelines, gave him a subtle thumbs up when delivering the first rent check envelope. Never seen anyone get paid to get bullied, he joked. Frank smiled. Patience pays dividends. The HOA, of course, tried to rewrite history. Their next newsletter featured a triumphant message from Karen. Through collaboration with local partners, Cedar Ridge successfully expanded its retail presence while preserving community harmony. There was even a photo of her cutting the ribbon in front of the mall, his mall technically, with the Miller Commons sign in the background. Frank cut that newsletter out and pinned it to his fridge beside the original violation notice. 2 trophies side by side. A few weeks later, he drove past the finished mall. The parking lot gleamed, new asphalt shining under the morning sun. The letters on the main sign had been swapped, no longer Ledbetter Plaza but Miller Commons. Big, bold, impossible to miss. He pulled over, stepped out of his truck, and just looked at it for a while. It wasn't pride he felt exactly. It was something quieter, deeper. The satisfaction of seeing justice arrive without having to shout for it. A teenage kid riding by on a skateboard yelled, "Hey, Mr. Miller! Nice mall." Frank chuckled. "Thanks, kid. Built it myself. Sort of. Back home." Buddy followed him out to the porch as he settled into his usual chair. The air smelled faintly of fried food drifting from the food court across the way. He didn't mind it. The mall lights flickered in the distance like fireflies, and the hum of late-night traffic became a lullaby of victory. He thought about the absurdity of it all. The HOA fines, the warnings, the endless letters that once made him roll his eyes. Now the same organization that had demanded he improve the view was paying him every month for the privilege of having that view. "Rules are rules," he said softly to Buddy, who thumped his tail against the porch. Later that week, a reporter from a regional news outlet called, wanting a quote for a piece titled, David versus HOA. The property dispute that paid off. Frank declined politely. "Not interested in fame," he said. "Just quiet." But fame has a way of finding irony irresistible. Within days, his story made its way to social media. Memes popped up. Pictures of him sitting calmly in his chair, captioned, "When you own half the mall they find you for looking at." Dale printed one on a coffee mug and gave it to him as a gift. The money started rolling in, small but steady. The rent check arrived like clockwork, always with a printed memo line, "Lease payment, parcel 27B. Frank never cashed it right away. He liked seeing them pile up neatly on his desk, proof that patience had outperformed pettiness. One afternoon, while trimming the bushes along the fence, he saw Karen drive by. For the first time in months, she didn't slow down to glare. She just stared straight ahead, sunglasses on, face stiff as marble. Frank lifted his hand and waved. She didn't wave back, but her brake lights flickered for a moment, like maybe she thought about it. He grinned. That counts. As evening settled, the neighborhood lights blinked on one by one. The air was soft with the smell of rain, and somewhere far off, the sprinklers began their nightly rhythm, the same sound that had framed his peace before all the madness began. He sat there, letting the nostalgia wash over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt the same quiet he'd once known before the HOA came knocking. Except now it wasn't just quiet, it was victory wearing slippers. He picked up his coffee cup, now half empty and lukewarm, and whispered to himself, "For once, they're paying me to exist." Across the street, the sign glowed against the dusk. Miller Commons. It was poetic, really. The same people who had accused him of damaging community harmony now did their weekend shopping under his name. The same president who had fined him for grass height had literally signed his paycheck. He leaned back, smiled, and listened to the night settling over Cedar Ridge. No lawsuits, no shouting, just irony, neatly notarized and direct deposited. And as the mall lights dimmed and the crickets took over, Frank let out a long, contented sigh. "You can't buy peace," he murmured, "but you sure can lease it." After the storm, life in Cedar Ridge returned to something that almost looked like peace. The air smelled cleaner, the hammers had stopped echoing, and the once hostile neighbors were suddenly friendly again. Even the HOA newsletters had quieted down. Just recipes, lost cats, and announcements about bake sales. You'd almost think the Great Mall War had never happened. Frank knew better. Every time he walked out onto his porch, the sign across the road reminded him otherwise. Miller Commons, lit up in calm white letters, a monument to paperwork and patience. On most evenings, he'd sit in his chair with Buddy lying at his feet, sipping his coffee while the mall's parking lot lights glowed like a distant campfire. The rumble of car engines, the occasional honk, the faint chatter of people heading home. It all blended into the background hum of a world that had finally learned to stay on its side of the fence. It wasn't that Frank had won a war. He just reminded everyone that the rules they used to control others could also be followed, precisely, thoroughly, and legally, to set them free. Dale stopped by one Sunday, carrying 2 cups of takeout coffee. "You realize, Buddy," he said, settling into the chair next to Frank's, "you're a local legend now. That guy who outsmarted the HOA. Half the folks down at the diner talk about you like you're a folk hero." Frank chuckled. "Folk heroes don't pay property taxes." "Still," Dale said, grinning, "you've done something no one around here ever thought possible. You made Karen shut up." Frank smiled at that, the faint lines around his eyes softening. "Nah, she didn't shut up. She just changed mailing addresses. Probably terrorizing another board somewhere." They both laughed. Across the road, the mall thrived. The grand opening had been modest, the ribbon-cutting ceremony smaller than planned, mostly because Karen was no longer HOA president. She'd stepped down to pursue personal ventures, which everyone agreed was HOA code for forced retirement. Her replacement, a soft-spoken accountant named Marty, had a completely different approach. When Frank met him at the grocery store one day, Marty shook his hand firmly. "Mr. Miller," he said, "I want you to know the board appreciates your attention to detail. We're trying to be better neighbors." Frank nodded. "Good fences make good paperwork." Marty laughed, though Frank could tell he didn't entirely get it. For the first time in months, Frank actually went to an HOA barbecue. It was smaller than before, less tense. People seemed human again. One woman apologized for siding with Karen. Another man admitted he'd just gone along with it, because he didn't want trouble. Frank told them all the same thing. No hard feelings. Just keep your stakes on your side of the grass. The mall lease checks kept arriving, each one perfectly punctual, each with that little note, Parcel 27B lease payment. He still hadn't spent much of the money. It wasn't about the cash. He just liked the principle of it, the way each envelope symbolized a victory that didn't require shouting or bitterness. One afternoon, he walked into one of the stores, a coffee shop that had set up near the edge of his parcel. The barista, a young kid with a beard barely worthy of the name, noticed his ID when he paid. "Wait," the kid said, eyes wide. "You're the Miller? Like, Miller Commons Miller?" Frank shrugged modestly. "That's what the sign says." The kid grinned. "Man, that's awesome. I heard the HOA tried to take your land, and you just out-legaled them." Frank smirked. "Something like that. Sometimes you don't need to fight fire with fire. Just hand 'em the matches and let 'em burn their own map." The kid laughed so hard he nearly spilled a latte. Frank left a tip big enough to buy a new one. That night, as he drove home, he slowed at the intersection where the old Ledbetter Plaza banner used to hang. For months it had symbolized frustration and intrusion. Now it was just a memory. The spotlights had been repurposed, illuminating the Miller Commons sign instead. Back on his porch, Frank watched the sunset bleed orange over the rooftops of Cedar Ridge. It struck him how peaceful everything looked again. The same sprinklers clicked on in the distance. The same air smelled faintly of grass and warm concrete. But something inside him had shifted. He'd learned that boundaries weren't just lines on paper. They were lessons in patience. When the HOA first started harassing him, he'd felt disbelief, then irritation, then anger. But what stuck with him now wasn't the fight. It was the stillness that came after. The realization that the best revenge wasn't loud. It was lawful, quiet, and undeniable. The local news did one last follow-up story a few months later. They titled it "When Common Sense Won," the farmer who beat the HOA. The article called him a modern-day David, who used the very system meant to oppress him as a tool of fairness. Frank thought that was dramatic, but Cliff loved it. "Free publicity," Cliff said over the phone. "Never hurts to have your name associated with common sense. You'd be amazed how rare that is in zoning disputes." Frank laughed. "You'd be amazed how rare it is in neighborhoods." Buddy barked from the porch, chasing off a rabbit that had wandered too close to the fence. Frank watched him for a moment, thinking about how even dogs understand property lines better than people sometimes. Later that evening, as dusk settled and the streetlights flickered on, Frank took out the box where he'd kept all the letters. The violation notices, the fines, the HOA newsletters, even the first draft of the lease agreement. He flipped through them one by one, shaking his head. Each page told a chapter of absurdity, but together they read like a comedy with a moral. How small people can become when they chase power without purpose, and how easy it is to win when you simply wait for arrogance to trip over itself. He slipped the papers back into the box and wrote a label across the top. Boundary lessons. The next morning, he drove into town to run errands. At a red light, a new neighbor pulled up beside him and rolled down her window. "Mr. Miller," she called out. "We just moved in last week. I heard your story. It's amazing." "Welcome to Cedar Ridge," he said, smiling. "Word of advice. Read the fine print on everything." She laughed as the light turned green. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the mall's roofline, Frank stood at the edge of his property one last time before heading in. The air was warm, and the cicadas had started their chorus. Across the road, families wandered in and out of the shops, completely unaware that half the ground they walked on belonged to the man watching quietly from the hill. He didn't feel smug anymore, just satisfied. It wasn't revenge, it was balance restored. Karen, wherever she was, probably told her version of the story differently. Maybe she said the lines were blurred, or the system was unfair. But Frank knew the truth. The system had been perfectly fair. She just never thought it would apply to her. He looked down at Buddy and said, "Guess peace doesn't come from silence, huh? Comes from standing your ground." Politely. Buddy wagged his tail, happy to agree. Inside, the old clock ticked steadily, the sound of time doing what it always does, moving forward, leaving the foolish behind. Frank poured himself one last cup of coffee, stepped back out to the porch and sat in his chair. The lights of Miller Commons glowed softly through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, someone laughed. It wasn't a mocking laugh this time, it was the good kind, the easy kind. Frank smiled, taking in the view, the quiet, and the justice of it all. So, he murmured, voice low and calm, if your HOA ever sends you a letter like mine, remember this. You can't control the petty, but you can outsmart it. Then he leaned back, let the night breeze carry the sound of sprinklers across the fields, and finally, truly, rested.